All right, you know this is our new experience, the Adult Faith Formation team. We're moving to 9:40. Makes me a little uncomfortable. I'm more comfortable with 9:34. That's when we used to start at 9:34, but now we're 9:40. But I'm going to start right now and introduce our speaker. But first, I'm going to welcome you. How many of you, this might be your first time in Adult Faith Formation Forum? Oh, good. Well, a couple. Welcome. We're glad you're here. We hope that you will make this a regular habit and ritual for your Sunday morning worship experience. Albert, I'm going to move this just a little down. Okay, very good. So again, welcome, and I am pleased to introduce this series this morning, this series that we decided to take on around this topic of happiness. Happiness seems to be a conversation in articles in the news and books on happiness. It just seems to be the zeitgeist. So we thought, well, let's talk about what does happiness mean for people of faith? What does that word mean? What does that mean? So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to explore the question, what does it truly mean to be happy? And especially as people who seek to follow the ways of love and justice of Jesus. The one who said, follow me, pick up your cross, die to yourself, and follow me. It's like, how does that hang together, right? How does that hang together? So next week we will have, the next topic is happiness is an inside job, and that will be with Leah Pearlman. Leah grew up in Montview Church. Leah is really known for creating the like button at Facebook. Serious, right? And like, we don't live without a like button anymore. So Leah, that is Leah's claim to fame. And so next week she'll talk about that experience and what that's done in her life following that. And the third week, the 28th of September, we will have Reverend Peter Marty, who is a Lutheran minister and is a part of Montview Church. Peter and his wife Susan, and he is also the executive editor of the Christian Century, and he'll be talking with us about living a life that means something. All right, so that's the series. We hope you'll come 3 weeks. Invite anyone who wants to talk about happiness. But this morning, it's my honor to welcome back to Montview Dr. Albert Hernández. He is an associate professor at Iliff School of Theology. His academic focus is the history of Christianity from medieval to modern times, with additional expertise in the history of the ancient Hellenistic Roman period. His research and teaching areas include the history of mysticism and pneumatology. I'll let you look that up later. Muslim and Christian relations, beginning with the Crusades, religious diversity in medieval Iberia and the Spanish Empire, and the history of medicine and pandemics. Dr. Hernández also led the faculty design team that created the Authentic Engagement Program, focusing his contribution on human flourishing and the philosophy of happiness. Please join me in giving a warm welcome back to Montview of Dr. Albert Hernández.
Good morning. It's great to be back here. This was one of the first churches that I spoke at when I moved to Colorado way back in 2001. So I've been working on happiness now for about 30 years. I work on it as a historian, although most people work on it from the perspective of ethics or of contemporary psychology. And even though we live in a somewhat nihilistic time, happiness is booming as a field of study. It's not usually referred to as happiness. It's most often referred to as wellness or human flourishing or eudaimonic studies. And I'll say a little bit about those words in a moment. But the history of Christianity in many ways cannot be separated from questions that were being asked in the ancient Roman Hellenistic world about what does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to flourish? And the Christians were asking the same question, but in slightly different ways than the Greco-Roman world was asking those questions. And it's interesting that 20 centuries later, and actually more than that, because the roots of these questions in the ancient world preceded Christianity. So let's say 25 centuries later, the world is still asking that question. Now, I don't work on Asian philosophies, but let's not lose sight of the reality that in India, in China, in Japan, in Korea, there were philosophies of happiness that predated the rise of the Greeks and the Romans and the rise of Christianity. I don't want to lose sight of that. But I don't specialize in that stuff, so I'm not going to go into that. But there are books available from a Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Confucian, etc. perspective about what does it mean to flourish. And in some ways, those views are different than Western views. They're less individualistic and more focused on collective and communal values. So happiness simply means lots of things happening, hopefully good things. That is the etymology of the English word happiness. Just a lot of things happening, or maybe a lot of good things happening. But I'm going to introduce the technical terms from the historical and theological and philosophical tradition. What is happiness? Is it being successful and wealthy? Is it being loved and appreciated? Is it discovering the mystery of life? Is it about freedom to be whatever you want to be? This is one that's really big in the United States of America. Think about that, okay? We saw that play out during COVID, where Americans were radically autonomous. Didn't want to do this, didn't want to do that, didn't want to follow this, didn't want to follow that. Sometimes this particular value of the freedom to be whatever you want to be undermines concern for the common good and public trust. Even though I'm not going to get into too much of that, happiness is never divorced from social concerns, from communal belonging, from the common good, or civic virtue, for example. And then here's a big one. Is happiness more about health and living a long life than anything else? And that includes all sorts of things that we would otherwise put under the rubric of social justice. Access to clean food, access to clean water, having a roof over our heads, access to education, access to health care, etc., etc. Or perhaps happiness is about finding your soulmate. And you find this also in the literature on human flourishing and on happiness. For some people, happiness is about finding that special someone, a lifelong partner, building a family, etc., etc. You get the picture. We've all thought about these things that are on this slide at one point or another. Happiness has been in the news for, I'd say, somewhere around 2010. It exploded into public consciousness, but it was already there as a subtle undercurrent in American ethics, American anthropology, American philosophy, and American religious values. One of the interesting trends in the mid-2000s, I'd say 2010 to about 2020, I think it's still in place, was happiness in the workplace. And there are other countries where there are journals that specialize on what does it mean to be happy as an employee. Remember, happiness is really about flourishing. So it's not just about the flourishing of the worker or the laborer, it's also about the flourishing of the organization. And how do you align a person's values and a person's life goals with the years that they spend working for a particular company? That matters. It matters more than some of us are willing to admit. And it has mattered to Americans tremendously for about the last 100 years. It matters even more in other countries where employee engagement is treated as a top priority in the workplace. and employee well-being is treated as a top priority in the workplace. In the United States, yeah, there are some companies who really care about their employees, and others who don't really put much, let's say don't invest much into their human resources. We see this all the time in the news. Harvard Business Review about a decade ago had a special issue, The Value of Happiness, How Employee Well-Being Drives Profits. Philosophers and theologians have criticized this because it monetizes the value of that human being, sometimes to excess. And you can see another example of that in the other slide, Laughing All the Way to the Bank, the giddy rise of the happiness movement, okay? Time magazine had a double issue a few years back on the pursuit of happiness in the American context. And I love this subtitle, Why Americans Are Wired to Be Happy and What That Is Doing to Us. Perhaps more so than any other country, we are constantly asking that question about happiness. We go about it in different ways than other countries do, but maybe there's something in our political DNA going back to the founding of the Republic. In the Declaration of Independence, in the Unalienable Rights Clause, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What a difference this made in American history. Jefferson, who is credited with drafting these words, could have gone the English route and the French route, where they said life, liberty, and the protection of property. But he didn't. He said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I believe that actually comes from Jefferson's own take on his Christian heritage, even though some would say, no, that guy wasn't a Christian. He was, maybe not an evangelical type of Christian or a denominational type of Christian, but he was. But perhaps even more so, he was a member of a philosophical and cultural movement known as neoclassicism. And the neoclassic movement identified very intimately with the legacies of Republican Rome and the legacies of the Hellenistic world. And within that context, within that culture, as I'm going to show in a few minutes, there were profound questions about what does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to be fully human? And even though Jefferson was a slave owner, and even though Jefferson had a lot of quirks and played a lot of nasty political games against his opponents on the other side of the aisle, the fact that the United States has this in its Declaration of Independence has made an incredible difference for ethnic groups, for different racial groups, for women, for all sorts of voices that in other countries are still struggling to have a voice in the political and social arenas of their respective societies. So I'm going to come back to that Hellenistic stuff in a moment. Does history repeat itself? Oops. Does history repeat itself? No. No. I tease my students at Iliff in the master's program and in the PhD program constantly with this. And they push back and they say, I don't care what Professor Hernández says. History repeats itself. History doesn't really repeat itself because no two historical moments are identical. No two historical agents are identical. You are not ancient Romans. I am not an ancient Hellenistic teacher. I am a modern American, Cuban American, by the way, who was born in the 20th century and is living out most of his adult life in the 21st century. We are not the ancient Romans, and the ancients were absolutely not us. But there is something that is repeating itself. In their world, 25 centuries ago, 20 centuries ago, 15, 16 centuries ago, there is something that is repeating itself. And that is the struggle of human consciousness for meaning, but in particular, meaning in a multicultural, multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious civilization that has gone through incredible trauma and incredible suffering in the last 100 years. Think about that. We may think we're the best that there has ever been, but I have relatives who survived World War II, and World War II took more than 80 million lives. I was born in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. We just went through a horrible pandemic, the worst pandemic in 100 years, and there are massive amounts of silent post-pandemic trauma out there. And COVID last year took nearly 48,000 American lives in 2024. That's the COVID death toll for the year 2024, and we believe that's an undercount. So one of the things that we have in common with that world that started the questions about human flourishing and happiness, is the fragmentation and the trauma and the suffering that comes from going through repeated military and economic and social and pandemic crises. Even though I think we genetically evolved to forget the horror and the terror of pandemics. That's why I think it's so hard for this country to talk about what we learned and what we didn't learn, what we succeeded at and what we failed at in the COVID mess. Think about these things, because again, history doesn't repeat itself, but there is something in the consciousness of our time, something in the burning questions for meaning of our time that has something to do with why those philosophers and theologians and religious thinkers and seekers from that time period, from that world, were asking the question, is this all there is? What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to flourish? Am I really better off because I can buy all these things? In a world where all possessions are but on loan to the possessor, what's the purpose of human life? And what about pleasure? They ask the question, aren't we programmed for pleasure? Haven't we evolved genetically, anthropologically, socially, to seek pleasure? And for them it was, well, yeah, pleasure is the absence of bodily and emotional pain, not pleasure as in hedonism. They were actually very critical of that. They'd probably think that contemporary American culture is too hedonistic if they were around. The Americans have contributed to the modern discourse on happiness. This is one of the reasons why happiness is everywhere in the media and the news, and every year dozens and dozens of books are published on the question of happiness. A group of Americans about 20 years ago now, maybe 25 years ago, started a branch of psychology called positive psychology. And one of their primary focus points was wellness, human flourishing, or what we also refer to as eudaimonic values. I have some trouble with positive psychology because it says that you can think your way out of suffering, that you can think your way out of trauma, that you can think your way out of all sorts of things, which, yes, you can, we can, but sometimes the weight of moral injury is so deep, so pervasive, that it's not quite as easy as some of the thinkers and writers and seminar and workshop presenters coming out of the field of positive psychology would have us believe. So again, I don't mean to essentialize the ancient Greeks, but Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle started the question, what is the good life? They had spent so much time working and teaching and writing about metaphysics, about political philosophy. Most of them thought democracy was broken and it was the worst form of government that they had invented because they concluded that democracy thrived on persuasion. And persuasion is more often than not about lies than about the truth. Sound familiar? In fact, Socrates was sentenced to death for critiquing Athenian democracy. So they were onto something back then. They were very critical about tyranny, authoritarianism, despotism, any philosophy, any political philosophy that tried to control the individual to them was immoral and just wrong. But towards the end of his life, probably out of disillusionment with all the wars and all the conquests and all the empire building and all the empire fragmentation that was going on around him, Aristotle shifted the discourse of philosophy to the question of happiness, and not with the word happiness. So, in the Nicomachean Ethics, and in another later medieval version called Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle began asking some very different questions. And he took the most common word in the Greek language that he knew as his native language and turned it into a philosophical concept. He was also the teacher of Alexander the Great, who led that world on a series of incredible conquests and adventures, building a multicultural, multiracial, multi-civilizational, multilingual empire that eventually stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Greek world, and eventually under the Romans from the Persian Gulf all the way to England. And because there was so much suffering, and because there were so many wars and imperial expansions and imperial collapses, so much violence, and eventually so much financial corruption, a crisis of meaning set into the philosophical and religious discourses of that world. Christianity is going to play that game of meeting that need better than any of the other philosophies, cults, religions, etc. Okay? I know we tend to think of Christianity as its own version of imperialism, but the reason that Christianity succeeded the way that it did in that world was because it was asking the same questions that were burning profoundly in the hearts and minds of the people of that world. And the fact that Jesus was a healer added to his mystique, added to his integrity, added to why they were attracted to the message of Jesus and the message in the New Testament. And the message of Hebrew wisdom as well. Let's not forget that part of it. So what is the good life? And how does one flourish despite the suffering and brokenness and trauma of human life? Well, here's the word. The word is eudaimonia. It shows up in all of the modern literature, many of the seminars and programs that are out there right now about human flourishing, about happiness. And it comes from two ancient Greek words. And it's still used today in the Greek world, by the way. My younger brother married into a Greek family, and I had the most wonderful conversations with some of my sister-in-law's older relatives about eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. And to this day, people in the Greek world sometimes pound their chest when they say eudaimonia. Eudaimonia comes from the word eu, meaning well, and from the word daimonia, meaning spirit. It literally means to be blessed with a good spirit. That's why they often say eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. It can be read as good fortune. It could be read as good luck. It could be read as being well blessed. So we almost always translate it as happiness, but that's a mistake. It really should be translated as human flourishing or flourishing. Okay? Think about this. Eudaimonia. Now the Christians would eventually have a problem with this, because Christianity would say, daimonia, that's your word for spirits. But we Christians, there's only one Spirit, and it's the Holy Spirit. So a really interesting and perhaps tragic debate ensued between the early Christian movement and all of the philosophical schools and all of the various cults and religions of that world. And that was a very big world, remember, from the Persian Gulf to northern England. If you are of Irish or Celtic ancestry, your ancestors clashed with this. They clashed with the church's pressure for them to forget their pre-Christian ancestral heritage. And we could say that about almost all of the indigenous peoples eventually of the world. But let me not digress. Christian exclusivity and essentialism is a subject for another day and a different kind of presentation. So what does flourishing mean to you? We'll come back to Q&A in about 11 minutes. What does flourishing mean to you? Think about this. Think about the heart. Because the ancients, whether Christian or pagan, and this is also true in the Asian religions and philosophies, they believe that the center of the human person is the heart, not the brain. It's only recently that we've become obsessed with the brain and the mind. The heart. What does it mean to be centered? That's why the Greeks to this day say eudaimonia. It meant to be well blessed with a good spirit in your heart. It meant to be well blessed with a good spirit in your chest. When you breathe in, maybe it's more about joy than about flourishing. Hint, that's where the Christians are going to take us. So, flourishing is often defined as a state of vigorous and sustainable growth, being healthy and strong, thriving and achieving success, the ultimate goal of a fully actualized life. Those are some takes that we've done. But the Christians are eventually, an attitude of mind and heart aimed at connecting self in meaningful, ethical, and life-enhancing ways to others and the whole of society. What a mouthful. That's a more textbook-oriented definition. The pursuit of happiness. Here are some of the schools of philosophy that we don't have time to get into. Epicureanism had their own way of defining eudaimonia. The Stoics had their own way of defining eudaimonia. The skeptics had their own way of defining eudaimonia. And the cynics had their own way of defining eudaimonia. These philosophical schools lasted for about 800 years, originating before Jesus, before the Christian era, and continuing until the end of the Roman Empire, when Christianity declared itself the official religion of the Roman Empire and said, you've all made the wrong choice. We are actually now in power, and we want your schools closed. True story. Sorry, I'm not picking on Christianity. That is part of our story. Each of these schools influenced the culture of the Roman Empire and eventually would influence modern social, political, and moral thought in the 1600s and the 1700s. During the rise of science, modern science, and during the rise of that neoclassical movement that I told you Thomas Jefferson was a part of. Which one of these, you don't need to answer this is a rhetorical question. Which one of these do you think Jesus might have chosen? Since we believe he interacted with some of these philosophers. We believe Paul definitely interacted with them, even debated with them in public. We believe the apostles interacted with these philosophers, and again, even debated with them in public. Have you noticed how each of these words has a slightly negative connotation in the modern English language? That's because the Christians thought these people were too wishy-washy, didn't have deep values, and quite frankly, didn't have the same values as the Hebraic tradition and the Christian tradition. But believe it or not, Jesus would have been very comfortable with one of these. Most of the early Christians who converted to Christianity, these are the educated early Christians who converted to Christianity. Most of them had been Stoics before they converted to Christianity. And Stoicism is incredibly similar to many of the teachings that we find in Jesus' message and in the messages of the early church. Whereas the early church talked about its relationship with the Holy Spirit, the Stoics talked about their relationship with the agathodaimon, literally meaning the good spirit. And we would translate that with a capital G and a capital S. And we could go on and on with more examples of that. The Stoics believed in fate. The Stoics believed in God. They believed in the importance of being a member of the community who contributed to the community. Eventually, the Stoics would argue for the equality of women and slaves, for the abolishment of ancient slavery, and for the importance of educating women at the same level that we educated men. But yet Jesus might not have been that comfortable with the Stoics. Believe it or not, for about 15 years, New Testament historians and theologians found evidence that Jesus had a cynic teacher at some point. The cynics were radically anti-consumerism, radically anti-empire, radically anti-financial manipulation and oppression and abuse of other populations and of other people. And, there were articles in the Society for Biblical Literature's journal, Jesus the Cynic. I don't agree. But there is evidence to indicate that because so many of Jesus' sayings sound like the sayings of the founders of cynicism, there is this possibility that the younger Jesus, before he started his public ministry, may have been influenced by cynic teachers that were itinerant teachers, itinerant philosophers, stand-up philosophers, just kidding about that one, in the regions of Palestine that Jesus frequented. Anyway, so I need to be mindful of time. I have more slides than there is time, but that's okay. This is one of the interesting ways that we can talk about. This particularly relates to American life, okay? Buddhism, not so much. Hinduism, not so much. But in American life, we think a lot about what are you going to do with your life? And there's lots of fill in the blanks there. I want to be, I want to do, I want to find. The discourse that goes back again 25 centuries, and Christianity talks a lot about this one as well. We have a tension in our lives between our instrumental values and goals and our intrinsic values and goals. This is all part of the discourse, okay? The tradition. Instrumental goals move us towards other goals. Think of things you've pursued in your life simply to achieve something else. Whereas intrinsic goals are pursued for their own sake. There's an element in them that is self-sufficient. Once you achieve a particular intrinsic goal, you may not need others. Notice I said you may not. I love to complexify things. Because we're creatures of doubt. We're creatures of anxiety. We are. But think about that. And then think of all of the sins that Christianity will be able to talk about with this model. The sin of avarice, the sin of greed, the sin of gluttony, the sins of violence, crimes of passion. Oh, I loved that person so much I couldn't let anyone else have them. I'm quoting directly from moral and ethical philosophy and theology that Christians have written. And what are the intrinsic values? For the ancients, it was happiness. It was eudaimonia. It was a life of flourishing. And all the things you did along the way to achieve that life of flourishing. The ancients invented the idea of retirement at the end of one's life. Not everyone could afford to do that. Not everyone can afford to do that today. So for Christianity, an intrinsic goal would be the love of God. The love of self. Because without self-compassion, there might not be the possibility for loving others. Following in the ways of Jesus is another intrinsic value and another intrinsic goal in the Christian context of these philosophies and traditions. Before I open it up to Q&A, let me say a little bit about how this is transformed in the hands of the Christians. The Latin word, and Christianity chose to explain itself to the world first in Greek and then in Latin. And for the Latin world of the Roman Empire and of the Middle Ages, it's the word beatitudo. Beatitudo is equivalent to the word eudaimonia. But beatitudo is most often translated as joy or as being well blessed. Very similar to eudaimonia, but not exactly the same thing. And you're all familiar with the Beatitudes. You could read the Beatitudes slightly differently. Blessed and joyful are the, even though the English translation just says, blessed are the. But it's really the word beatitude, if you read it in the Latin vernacular. So happiness in the Christian life, a spiritual flourishing. And not just as an individual, but as spiritual flourishing as a member of a community a community that is interested in charity, the dignity of the oppressed, feeding the hungry, housing the unhoused, and sometimes prophetically standing up to tyranny that is depriving the human community and the human person of all these other aspects of flourishing. I'm going to skip over this slide. It's just trying to drive home the point about how Christianity thrived in the Roman Empire, because Christianity was asking the same kinds of questions that the Epicureans, the Stoics, the skeptics, the cynics, and all the different cults and religions of the empire were asking. What does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to be part of a community that cares about you and a community that you also give back to? Interesting parallel there. Maybe that's one of the ways in which history is repeating itself. We're asking very similar questions right now in 2025 in this country. And last, I just want to leave you with, you've heard of Augustine of Hippo, and you've heard of Thomas Aquinas, the two Christian theologians who wrote the most about happiness. I'll focus on Aquinas. Aquinas said that God made human beings for fructus and beatitude. Fructus means abundance. Beatitude means joy. Now, you may not think of Christianity you may not think of all Christian traditions and denominations as having that kind of view of the human person, but Aquinas, because of his background in Greco-Roman philosophy, in Christian theology, in Islamic theology and philosophy, and in Jewish theology and philosophy, Aquinas believed that the fact that we are told in the Hebrew Scriptures that we are created in the image and likeness of God, for Aquinas that was inseparable from philosophies of eudaimonia and beatitude. Aquinas believed, like many of his era, Jewish, Muslim philosophers and theologians, as well as the ancient Greeks and Romans, that the human person was encrypted with divinity, quite literally in the heart. And he took that from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where we learn that we are created in the image and likeness of the highest God. For Aquinas and his contemporaries, and really for Christian theology and moral theology in general, this is not some symbol picked out of a Hebrew scripture. This is considered one of the most important facets of human nature, and it opens the door to some of our loftiest ideals and values about human dignity, about social justice, about charity and compassion and service to others, but also about self-compassion. So, Aquinas believed that if the sovereign, meaning the king, the queen, the emperor, the local Dutch or duchess, the local baron or baroness, if they undermined and took away the people's God-given right to beatitudo and fructus, it might be necessary to remove them from power, because it was important to restore the divine relationship and the dignity of the human person. So Aquinas writes this around 1265 in a little-known treatise, a gift that he sent to the king of Cyprus called De Regno, on kingship, many, many, many years before 1776, and many, many, many years before Thomas Jefferson penned those quintessential American words about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think well, pretty good, I fit it in. I've been doing this a long time. But there's also a lot that I left out. I encourage you to read further. You don't really need any book recommendations from me. You can just Google happiness or human flourishing, and you will get more hits back than you wanted. And also on Amazon. Anyway, Q&A time. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's a lot percolating in your minds and hearts. Yes?
Thanks for the wonderful talk. And I really appreciated your comments near the end about happiness. It also involves the community in which we live, the community of friends. Take it another level, if you would. What about happiness of what today we're so whom we frequently call enemies. What's our connection to those folks?
Yes. So what does the discourse on happiness say about relationship to those whom we label as enemies? Aquinas and Augustine, I'm going to approach it from a Christian standpoint. Aquinas and Augustine talked a lot about love of self as the highest form of love, love of others as a second very important form of love. And I would say that in that way, in that discourse about what does it mean to flourish, it also reminds us that we are individuals, but we live in community. We are social creatures. We have evolved and been created to be in relationship with others. And then not only the medieval Christian tradition, but the ancient tradition talks a lot about the importance of dialogues of mutual edification. Dialogues of mutual edification where we can discourse even with someone whom we vehemently disagree with, or perhaps someone who our society has labeled as an other, has labeled as an enemy, has labeled as a danger to the state. So these things are in the tradition. Whether or not we live up to them is a different story. And from the earliest days of the American Republic, our system was founded on the notion of compromise through dialogue, and mutual edification on both sides of an ideological divide or on both sides of a crisis. We seem to have lost some of that sense. I mean, I work in a world that is supposed to be all about discourse and all about dialogues of mutual edification and constructive criticism, and there are so many professors and so many students in this country and in other parts of the world, but we have a particular problem that are completely polarized and bifurcated. I'm even afraid to bring up certain subjects in some of my classes for fear of whom I'm going to trigger. So it requires patience. I think it requires a commitment to communal values of mutual edification. And sorry, I sound like I'm preaching now, but I don't know if that adds to you, if that is in line with your question. Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. Maybe one that we need to ask more and more in our particular society at this moment in our history. Yes,
This
sir.
is a very elementary question. Epicureanism, to me, is the love of food.
Yes.
Can you describe what you're...
Yes, yes.
Define that.
Yes, well, the Epicureans got stereotyped for being, the question is, Epicureanism is synonymous with good food, or with the love of food, the passion for food. The Epicureans said that eudaimonia was based upon finding an absence of bodily and emotional pain. And if you could live your life with an absence of bodily and emotional pain, you would achieve eudaimonia, or ataraxia was another one of the words. Ataraxia literally means peace of mind. In the process, because the Epicureans wanted to live in community, they had their own houses, their own estates, their own communes, if you will, to use a modern term. They were really passionate about growing their own food and animal husbandry. Not on a large scale, but on a small scale. And so over the centuries, the Epicurean predisposition to culinary pleasure, to the relationship between food and health, the notion that food is indeed medicine if you eat the right foods, I think became solidified in the popular culture and the popular imagination. I'm from Miami, Florida, where on Miami Beach for many years there was a health, before Whole Foods, there was a very popular health food market, and it was called Epicure. So that's the trajectory there of that story. Eventually, Epicureanism is stereotyped as being about nothing more than eat, drink, and be merry. And believe me, Epicurus and the Epicureans, a philosophical school that lasted for 700 years, They were not at all about that. They would not have gotten involved in a revolution or in a social justice fight because they were passionate about the absence of bodily and emotional pain. But anyway, so that's a little bit more than you asked me about, but I wanted to fill in context because when I was moving quickly through the slides, I wasn't able to pause for very long on the Epicureans. But thank you for that question. Other questions? Yes.
Twofold. Could you speak about the pursuit of happiness in that epidemic of loneliness?
Oh,
in
thank
our
you for asking that.
Culture and the rise of the epidemic, I call it, of AI.
Thank you very much. So happiness, the discourses on happiness, and I'm familiar with them across 25 centuries, I really am, have often been very concerned about alienation, also known as estrangement. What is it in certain societies and at certain moments in this history and the life cycle of that society that alienates people? Not just from each other, but even from themselves, okay? And then that raises questions about self-compassion. That raises questions about the common good. But it also raises questions about technology. There are technologies that, and by the way, the word techna is another Greek word, and it had nothing to do with what you think it has to do. It came out of medical and health services. It came out of the medical and the healing arts. In fact, the word is techna iatrica, which literally means medical technology or medical techniques, healing techniques. When they write the history of our time, 200 or 300 years from now, one of the things that there will be unavoidable is the epidemic, declared an epidemic by the U.S. Surgeon General, of loneliness in the United States. Part of it is the technology, part of it is the way we live. I have relatives who, when we have a birthday in the family, don't even call each other anymore, they just text. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, that was unheard of. My children who are still in their 20s lament. They call their friends the look-down people because this is all they ever do. I have 4 children. 2 of my children, when they go out with their friends, sometimes say, hey, no mobile phones. Put it away. Put it in your purse, put it in your pocket, get it out of here. Not everyone does that. And yet, look, I have that toy too. And it comes in really handy when you break down between Denver and New Mexico and northern New Mexico in that wasteland where there's nothing for miles and miles and miles and miles around you. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that other than to acknowledge that alienation is a very big problem in our time. And it's not just alienation from others. There are millions of Americans who are touch deprived. No one holds them. No one hugs them. No one kisses them. Suicide is the highest that it's been in American history since the late 50s and early 60s. The highest. And in some professions, it's the highest rates of suicide that we have ever seen. And yes, there are mental health issues, but loneliness is a big part of that. The elderly in our society. You know, we are a society that is so obsessed with youth culture. You know, and yet our population is getting older and older and older because, you know, the birth rate is flat in most of the planet. There are very few countries where the birth rate is on the other side. In most countries, the birth rate is flat or declining. But thank you for pointing that out because it would be incomplete if I talked about happiness without talking about the epidemic of loneliness and what is also alienation, but also what the technologies are doing to communal belonging, as we say, to the sense of the relationship with others and self, right? Because there are people who spend more time on their toys. I know people in my own workplace, among my students and in my family, who spend more time on their gadgets than they do talking to another human being or touching another human being or being touched by another human being.
I think we have time for one more. Yes.
Can we fit two in? Only because he's had his hand up for quite a while. Wait, we need the...
Are you happy? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Fantastic. Thank you for asking me that. I almost always get asked that. If my youngest son were in the room, he'd say, please don't make him talk more than necessary. Yeah, my son said, Dad, you're a teacher. I guess they pay you to talk, but could I pay you to stop talking? I am happy in some aspects of my life, sir. In other aspects of my life, I am not. I am very worried that my children live in a world that they believe is falling apart. And I don't mean just the United States. I mean, one of my children is an oceanographer and is very concerned about the health of the seas. Sometimes I have to say, please, stop talking to me about the seas. Because when my early passion was marine biology, and when I start thinking of what's happening to the oceans, I end up with my own climate change infused anxiety. I'm a native Floridian. My ancestors are from the Caribbean. The reefs that I love, that I spent so much time on as a young man, are dying. So there are things that I'm happy about. I love my job. I never go home in a bad mood. I absolutely love teaching. I absolutely love doing things like this. So I guess my teaching is one of my intrinsic values, but I'm very concerned about a number of trajectories and challenges that we are facing in the early 21st century. And I don't see how we're going to reverse some of these issues. A new world is coming. The seas will be much higher in the year 2100. That is not reversible at this point. Sorry, I'm probably depressing some of you. One last question. Yes.
Yes, it's actually similar to what you've just spoken to. We've spoken quite a bit about the community of humans and the sense of belonging and the sense of isolation. I'm quite sure that back 2,500 years ago, people felt a lot more related to the more than human world than they are today. And I'm wondering if you might want to comment on what happened when Christianity took over, for example, what happened in the British Isles when you have now a sense of Celtic Christianity versus Roman Christianity in terms of relationship with the more than humans.
Yes, thank you very much for asking the question about what was it like? What was happiness? What was communal belonging like before we modernized ourselves so much that we forgot that we too are part of the natural world? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Yeah, I think part of the loneliness crisis and the alienation is that we are so divorced, so separated from the natural world. Not everyone. Some of us are. But you know, Christianity had a hand in that, for better or for worse. Christianity told some of my ancestors that their reverence for the natural world was demonic. I'm descended from Iberian Celts, not Irish from the British, not from the islands, but from Iberian Celts, the land of the Gaels, known to the Spaniards as Galicia, or Gaul to the ancients, the homeland of the Gaelic language. And I know that in my family, there has always been a love-hate relationship with Christianity. My grandmother spoke about it, her mother spoke about it, and it was probably passed down from generation to generation. So I do believe that in the process of secularization and modernization, and in the process of Christianization, we ended up, divorced is a word, alienated is another word, but I think we also suffer from amnesia of our connection to the natural world and the cycles of the earth. There is something about living in harmony with the cycles and the seasons. We can do that through the church calendar, but not all denominations do that. And I do believe that it's part of our alienation. Something as simple as getting Americans to tend local neighborhood gardens changes mental health and emotional moods instantly. Even caring for a plant at home, we know there are studies that show it has a positive effect. Going for a walk along the lakeshore, or going for a walk along the seashore, or going for a walk. Nature is only 30 minutes away from us. And I mean real nature, not these city parks. But those help too. So I could go on and on about your question. I don't know how we reverse that. The wisdom of indigenous traditions that have so much to teach us about that communal sense of belonging and participation in the natural world have been under assault by modern colonialism and Christianity. And I do see a change in my children's generation. They are extremely interested about their rootedness in the natural world as themselves living creatures. So there is a lot of that going on. John Philip Newell, an incredible contemporary writer, has been talking about how Christianity can recover the amnesia that it suffers from about the earth. And by extension, he says the whole of modern civilization needs to remember that we are intimately connected to the earth. Anyway, so that's my response too. Thank you for asking that. I think we're out of time.
I'm sure I speak for all of us that we're thankful that you love your work, that you love teaching, and you are willing to share with groups like ours. I have learned so much in the last hour, and you've given us lots to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity and the invitation. I really appreciate the questions because you make me think deeper. And I enjoy very much speaking here every time that I've ever been here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for making time to be with us. And so next week we continue our series on happiness, and we'll have Leah Perlman speak about that like button. So join us then. Thank you.